Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last session of the day, the last session of the CPEC's Smart Growth Summit, and thank you so much for joining us. This session is titled Placemaking to Placekeeping, Harnessing Unique Assets for Community Revitalization. My name is Liz Goad. I'm the grant writer for CPECs, and I'll be moderating today's panel. Before I introduce everyone, I want to take a minute to thank the sponsor for this session, Lamar Advertising, along with the rest of our summit sponsors and volunteers and everybody who has made this event possible. Thank you so much. And to all of you who have attended, it's been a really exciting 2 days. For this last session, we'll be covering a topic that planners love to talk about, which is placemaking, creating vibrant spaces where people want to live, work, visit, play, all of the good things in life. And a term that has been emerging in conversations about placemaking. It's not a new concept or a new idea, but I would say it's innate to us as humans, but it's a term that can shape how we approach planning and development, and that is placekeeping. Today, we'll learn about that, what it means, and how we as planners and leaders and citizens can honor cultural and natural assets and give communities the tools and incentives not just to grow, but to grow in ways that are equitable and inclusive and authentic. This is especially relevant here in Louisiana, where we're known all over the world for our culture and our traditions and just really cool, authentic places. And those places are changing in ways that we have heard about throughout all of the sessions for the past 2 days. So I'm really excited to hear our speakers' perspectives on placekeeping and how we can embrace this in our communities. And I will bring out those speakers in a moment, but first we have a little surprise in store for those of you who have bravely stuck it out for 2 whole days and made it to the last session. Corey Porsche is a licensed professional counselor and an organizational development consultant for Booz Allen Hamilton. He also happens to be a musician, a dance instructor, and an amateur folklorist. And we're so lucky and so glad to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming special guest, Corey Porsche.
Thank you. Thank you. I know the conference is coming to an end and you guys might have just ate lunch, so I'm going to be brief. When I was asked to do this, I was told that the topic of this talk was going to be placemaking and placekeeping. I think that I'm going to be slightly off of what the rest of the speakers might be talking about, but hopefully I'll give a bit of a cultural perspective that might fuel some of the way that you guys approach this subject. I want to talk about placemaking and placekeeping from a cultural perspective, and we're very fortunate in Louisiana that this place happens to be amazing, right? So it's rooted in several hundred years of various cultures coming together in a context, a legal context that was different from everywhere else in the country. And because of that, we have a culture that is vibrant, unique, and very much alive. So I'm just going to briefly talk about this through my experience of consumption, production, and ultimately sharing this culture of ours. From a consuming standpoint, it's really in the way that we grow up. I'm from Lafayette, Louisiana. And the way that we talk to each other, the way that we interact with each other, oftentimes when people come to visit from France, they say that there's a chaleur, like a warmth between people, even when they interact at the grocery stores, that's different than where you see it in other places in the world. Also, like peering, under my grandmother's gaze as she made these amazing foodways that we have, the roux for a gumbo, or smothering pork chops, or watching my grandfather boil crawfish. All these things I started to kind of soak up. The other thing is like the way that we interact with music and our foodways is very much alive and well and vibrant. And these are things that we do as I travel the world and share this culture with other places. Something that I notice is aspects of their culture they'll put in museums. They'll have maybe like once a month interactions where people are trying to hold on to something. That's not the case here. This is actually just what we do. This is how we eat. This is how we cook. This is how we interact. music, I was really big on kind of taking in all that I could. So some of the greats that are no longer with us, I would go out and visit and take part. Spent several years with Boisek Ardouin, a very famous Creole accordion player, and just I don't know how much time we spent playing as much as we learned, like watching him feed his chickens and the way that he interacted with his children and with his wife. Production. As we get older and we start to own some of these things, we also celebrate them. So, it's very often that a friend of mine would call, and the way that he would want to hang out is he would say, like, hey, do you want to come cook a sauce? And what that means in Louisiana might be different. Well, I think other people do it with barbecues, but it's a gathering. We're going to get together. We're going to co-create something. We're going to play music, etc. Also, I am now the crawfish cooker for the family. I got that from my grandfather. I was the only one of about 27 grandchildren that were able to actually stir the roof for my grandmother. So, we consume and then we're able to produce. And then ultimately sharing. Each year, people come from all over the world and they take their vacations to come and spend a week with us to see what we do every day. So through various festivals and week-long heritage events like the Black Pot Festival in Lafayette, the Dewey Balfa Cajun and Creole Heritage Week, we share how to dance, we share how to play the violin or the fiddle, as well as the accordion. And through these experiences, I've been able to literally travel the world, played in Denmark. I've taught 600 Danes on a dance floor how to dance. Every year we go up to Washington State to a fiddlers convention, fiddle and dance convention, where they bring a bunch of us up there to share this culture with them. It's almost like a colonization. There's these little pockets all over the country where people are interested in this, and we go and we share, and then we step back, and they start their own bands and have their own dances. So it's like Louisiana started out as a colony, and now we're out there colonizing others. Also, organizations like Louisiana Folk Roots that I'm involved with, who's a nonprofit, and what we focus on is we hold the annual event where folks come and learn our foodways and our instrumentation and how we play music as well as dance. And we also go into schools and share this with students. We do that through various grants, and we also have kids camp two times during the summer in two different locations where we actually bring kids in and we let them hold instruments. We teach them how to play the instruments. We reiterate our culture and foodways and things of that nature. So I think the message here is in Louisiana, the tree is strong. It's important to water our roots, allow the branches to grow, and share those fruits with those near and far. So with that, I'm going to play a little tune for you guys called Bill La Manche that I learned from a friend of mine named Ed Poulard, who he learned from Mr. Canray Fontenot. A couple of side notes. I actually gig on the accordion, not the fiddle, so be gentle.
Il a mange, il a volé des moutons, il a volé des moutons en Ezim Vidrin. Qui dit qui c'est la cause, c'est la baba d'Elinda. Il a mange, il était un bon travaillant, il travaille tous les jours, il voyageait tous les soirs. Qui dit qui c'est la cause, c'est la baba d'Elinda. manche était un bon travaillant. Il travaille tous les jours, il voyageait tous les soirs. Qui dit qui c'est la cause, c'est la boba de Linda.
Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Wow. That was awesome, right? Such an unexpected treat at the end of the day. Well, now for our session, I'm really excited to introduce our speakers for today, and then we'll go ahead and bring them out. Nate Storing is the co-executive director at Project for Public Spaces, a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to creating and sustaining public places that build communities. He's a writer and nonprofit leader with a passion for engaging the public in urban design, policy, and planning. In his 9 years at Project for Public Spaces, he served as the program director for 3 International Placemaking Week conferences and led the research, writing, and production of several published resources that you can find out more about on our website in his full bio. Kona Gray is principal at EDSA and our keynote speaker for the 2024 Smart Growth Summit, and also the president-elect of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Over the past 30 years, his work has touched more than 30 countries. His projects are inspired by a passion for creative design solutions that solve meaningful global issues, and he consistently takes into consideration important factors like community heritage, environment, and a constant pursuit of improving humanity through landscape architecture. And finally, Brandon Sertain is a real Renaissance man, a real estate analyst, designer, and exhibiting artist who lives and works in Louisiana. A native of New Orleans, Brandon attended Tulane University, where he received 2 masters in architecture and a master's in sustainable real estate development. He also earned a BFA from LSU in painting and drawing. And during that time, he also happened to be a member of the LSU football team. He currently works in affordable housing with a concentration in building equitable, resilient communities. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. And Nate, we'll get started with you.
All right. Thank you, Liz. Thank you all for being here the last session of the day. Really appreciate you sticking it out. I'm going to try to make this fairly quick so we can get to a discussion. But I was tasked with sort of providing some definitions for this conversation because I feel like, you know, these terms are kind of jargony. They're sort of floating around in all sorts of different ways. So I'm going to do my best to actually give a little bit of an introduction to what we're really talking about. But before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about the organization I work for. So my name's Nate Storing. I am the co-executive director of Project for Public Spaces. And we're a national nonprofit organization that was founded in 1975 based on the belief that basically public spaces is the foundation of strong communities. And since then, we've been working with the people who use those public spaces every day to improve them, right? Parks, streets, markets, plazas, pretty much anything that is accessible to the public, that's where we work. And we also try to provide tools and resources to help others do that kind of community-engaged work. And we call this process, this community process for improving public space, placemaking. But what is placemaking anyways, right? Just as a show of hands, like who's familiar with this term placemaking in their work? Okay, great, so lots of you. Who would be really confident in giving a clear definition of what placemaking is? So no one's put up their hands, just in case you haven't seen it. Totally fair response. So the reason for that is, like, we've worked all around the world, right? We worked in over 50 countries, all 50 US states, and we hear this term everywhere. It's kind of exploded in popularity, I'd say, over the last like 15, 20 years or so. We also organized this International Placemaking Week conference. This will be our 4th one this year. We've done that in Vancouver, in Amsterdam, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we're coming to Baltimore in June. And so, like, we interact with a lot of people who are using this terminology: public sector, private sector, nonprofits, right? Designers, planners, real estate developers, marketing people, artists, right? All sorts of different people that are using this term. Everyone's using it in a completely different way. And what's more, you're also seeing a little bit more controversy around this term. I think particularly in the academic community, among activists, there's this sort of concern of, like, is placemaking a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And what I'd love to put out there is maybe we should be thinking of placemaking kind of more like design or architecture as a term, right? There's good architecture and there's bad architecture. There's good design and there's bad design. And I think of placemaking very much the same way, right? There's good placemaking and there's bad placemaking. But I do want to kind of bring us back to a common definition, because it's all well and good to say that everyone's using it a little differently, but we do need to actually have a foundation. So this is a definition that I like to use in my work, and it's from 1995. So, like, this is actually a pretty old term. And as an organization, we started using this term placemaking pretty much like right after this. So this is from a book called Placemaking: The Art of Building Communities by Linda Schneekloth and Robert Shibley. And in the book, they say placemaking is the way that all of us as human beings transform the places in which we find ourselves into places in which we live, right? So the thing I like about this definition is that it points out that we're actually kind of all doing this all the time. It's not some kind of like special thing that only experts get to do. It's not something that only artists get to do. It's actually something that everyone is doing all the time. And I think Corey's sort of speech before his performance was a really great example of all of the ways that we're all actually engaging in placemaking all the time. So just to give a really concrete example, this isn't just like a warm and fuzzy thing. This is actually something that you can see around you in everyday places. So this is an example from another book called How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand. And he starts out the book with just these 2 townhomes in New Orleans, right? And you can see on the left, this is what they looked like when they were built in 1857, completely identical houses. But then when he revisits them in 1993, you wouldn't even know that these buildings, were designed to be identical, right? And that's because of generations of investments of the users of those buildings, right? People who are experiencing them every day and saying, I think we could use a little more space. Or, I really don't like the aesthetic of this. I think I'm going to change that. We as humans, we're always trying to alter our environments to make them more useful, more meaningful to us. And that's what the result of this is. That's placemaking. But then when you get into the public realm, placemaking gets a lot more complicated, right? So this is a great diagram from the Municipal Art Society of what like a street plaza looks like in New York City. And the thing that it's pointing out is all of these different elements in this public space are actually the jurisdiction of different organizations, right? It's not any one organization's job to care for this plaza as a public space. It's the Parks Department, it's the Department of Transportation, it's the Transit Authority, it's private property owners, it's the Business Improvement District. They are all responsible for this space collectively, and they all have differing priorities, right? Whether that's moving vehicles as efficiently as possible, or storing vehicles, or it's reducing the maintenance costs of public infrastructure, or it's maximizing property values, right? These are all different priorities that are not really aligned. And ultimately, sometimes what that means is when we're walking through the public realm, it doesn't really ever come together as an experience, right? It's no one's job to do that, even though anyone in this room could probably walk through that space and tell you what's working and what's not. Do I feel comfortable there? Do I feel welcome there? We all intuitively know that, and yet that common sense doesn't translate into our public realm. So that's where a project for public spaces comes in. We try to reconnect that intuitive, holistic sense that we all have of place to public spaces. So when we are working in public space, this is the definition that we use of placemaking. Placemaking is a community-based process of visioning, experimentation, and care to change the way people use and experience a public space. So this is the actual process of what that looks like in action. It starts with, of course, identifying the place that we're going to be working, but also identifying the stakeholders, all of the diverse people who are involved in that public space. That could be users of the space, like residents, business owners, workers. It could be nonprofits that have something to do in the space, whether that's programming or care or anything like that. Public agencies that have decision-making power of the space. All those people, we try to get them together and at the table at the very beginning of the process before any important decisions get made. It's a huge mistake that is often made when we're designing the public realm, is just like, yeah, you engage the community, but it's after all the important decisions have already been made. Bring them in at the very beginning. Then we give those folks the tools, these sort of a common set of tools to evaluate the space, identify the issues, and brainstorm their own ideas for how they could improve the space. We help them synthesize all of that into a vision for the space, which is partly about design, right? We will actually come up with a concept design for space, but it's also about the management of the space. It's also about the programming of the space. Those are all tools, or policies too, right? Like, what are you allowed to do in the space? All of those things influence our experience of space, and so our visions actually try to incorporate all those different elements. And then in our favorite projects, we actually get to stay involved all the way through implementation, which includes short-term experiments and trying to build management capacity, and then reevaluating those experiments and trying to make some long-term improvements. So just a few examples of what this looks like in practice. This is Campus Martius in Detroit, Michigan, where over the course of about 20 years, we were able to work with a variety of stakeholders to transform this traffic island into one of America's most beloved public squares. Smaller examples, right? In Woodruff Park in Atlanta, transforming an underutilized area of a park into a gathering place that also provides social services for people experiencing homelessness, mental health challenges, and addiction. In New Orleans, right? Transforming a sort of industrial lot next to the Lafitte Greenway into a plaza for the adjacent community to sort of extend those resilience benefits of that project into social resilience for people as well. And that's what that looks like at the end. Or in San Antonio, transforming an underpass into a hangout for teenagers, right? And working with those teenagers directly to figure out what do they want to do in the space. So I'm going to try to go through this very quickly because I'm running out of time. But I want to introduce these other two terms, creative placemaking and creative placekeeping, right? And the important thing I want to stress is these are kind of later terms that actually emerged, in this case, 15 years after that initial quote that I gave you. So creative placemaking really was coined in this white paper by Anne Godwin and Anne Marcuson, and this is the definition that they give. In creative placemaking, partners from public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors strategically shape the physical and social character of a neighborhood, town, city, or region around arts and culture activities. So sounds a bit like the definition I gave, but I think the thing I'd emphasize is they really center the arts in the process as the key sort of agents of change. And this white paper is also really based in economic development, and particularly the sort of Richard Florida flavor of economic development, attracting people to cities, talented young people particularly, to kind of spur economic development. And I'm just going to move on to the next definition here. So creative placemaking was sort of a response, or creative placekeeping, sorry, was sort of a response to the rise of creative placemaking, not just as a new term, but there was a lot of philanthropic action, about $150 million invested over 10 years into creating creative placemaking as a field of practice. And some of those people who were involved in that very practice started recognizing that there was maybe something missing from this conversation. And what it was this idea of belonging and disbelonging, right? And the politics of that. Who actually gets to be a cultural producer? Who actually feels welcome in a space that has all these cultural amenities? That's sort of where creative placekeeping comes from. So there's a definition, it's kind of hard to find a great one online, but this is one from a webinar that was led by the US Department of Arts and Culture. And they said, creative placekeeping is the active care and maintenance of a place and its social fabric by the people who live and work there, keeping the cultural memories associated with a locale alive while supporting the ability of local people to maintain their way of life as they choose. So I'll stop with this last slide here, which is just a bit of a comparison and contrast between these two terms, right? If creative placemaking is primarily about livability, right, and sort of attracting economic development through these amenities, creative placekeeping is about belonging, and particularly do the people who are already in a place feel welcome there, feel like they're honored in that space. Creative placemaking, it's primarily about transformation, right? Changing a place. Whereas creative placekeeping is a kind of preservation, but particularly focused on the people who are there, their culture, their foodways, their music, right? Their stories, their memories. That's what we're preserving, not necessarily buildings. Creative placemaking is really led by artists and arts organizations primarily, always in consultation with the community, but they're sort of the hero of the story in some ways. And creative placekeeping is really community-led, sometimes with very limited resources. And then finally, creative placemaking has historically had a lot of institutional support, and creative placekeeping has really relied on the resourcefulness of local communities. And the last thing I'll say is I think it's really important to think of these two terms as complementary, right, and situational. Depending on the context, you might lean more into creative placemaking as a stance or lean more into creative placekeeping as a stance, and it really depends on the community that you're working in. We can also think of them as kind of a spectrum. You can actually borrow bits and pieces from both of these stances in your work, and they may be appropriate in different ways. All right, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate.
Good afternoon. Let's try that again. Good afternoon. All right, let me get my stopwatch going here. Stay on time. Nate did a really good job getting us going here. First of all, I got to let you all know, I love CPEX. This is my first. All right, very excited to be here. Thank you all for coming out again and staying involved with this. It's really important. So I'm going to get into this conversation about what's in it for me. Right, this whole power of placekeeping, because I think it's really important. And Nate did a really good job setting us up here. I think it's interesting to me that people want to know how they will benefit. I think it's really simple. You know, it's like, well, how's that going to affect me? That's why they show up at your meetings very angry, because they think something's about to go down, right? And once they find out what's happening, it starts to, you know, get a little bit better, especially if they realize that there's a benefit for them. I think the critical point of this is the success really requires the community to be involved. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through sort of the process of this placekeeping in a place that I love. It's near and dear to me, in the Bahamas. This place went through a lot. This place is called Ragged Island. It's the last island in the Bahamian chain of family islands, down near almost to Cuba. And in 2017, Hurricane Irma came through, and she did a number. Right? She wiped it out, basically. And these people lost their livelihood. They lost their homes. We all know about this. I live in Florida. It was pretty disruptive and traumatic. Our client happens to be from Ragged Island. And she reached out to us when Hurricane Dorian went through the Abacos and said, okay, enough's enough. We got to do something. Can you help us? And we're like, well, look, you know, we would think that the government would be planning and getting sort of things in order for these communities to rebound, to be more resilient. But they weren't. What the government was doing is they were coming in, they're cleaning it up, and then they're getting out. Rinse and repeat, right? How many times does that happen in the Bahamas? Over and over and over again. And what was sad is that these folks were losing their way of life. So they got down to only 50 people on the island at one point, which was really amazing to see that people just left because there was nothing for them to do and nowhere for them to go. So in the process of placekeeping, we believe that it's very important to get to know the people. And that's what we did here. I love this image in the lower center. That's our client Marina and her cousin Kennedy, who she had not seen in like 20 years. Because, you know, she's pretty successful and she moved away and she worked for Disney. She was involved in, you know, finding great talent and organizational development, and that came in handy with the work we had to do here. But it was just very interesting to see how there was sort of this brain drain where people would leave the island, right? And so the first step in our process was just getting to know the people, a bunch of discovery. That image in the upper left there, I had a great time hanging out playing dominoes and drinking beer, right? Something very, very simple, right? Getting to know the people on a level that is personal, where they come to realize that you are there to help. and you want to be part of the community as well. And so we start to see their way of life. We started to see how they interacted. These are folks that are anglers. They're very much into fishing because that's their resource. They're into a lot of things that are nature-based, which we found very, very cool. The next thing in our process that we wanted to understand and get to know was the land. And this is very, very critical. In so many places, we like I discussed yesterday, we take land for granted. You know, that image in the upper left there, that's a pirate cave. It's really cool. There's so many amazing, wonderful aspects of the land that we just didn't know about until we got there. Like I said, the place is very known for fishing. A lot of folks come from all over the world to come down there to do deep sea fishing, and it's just really fantastic. So a lot of great ecology, a lot of great language as it relates to a place being a place. And then the next and last thing we did in part of our discovery was understanding the culture, right? That image in the upper left, conch. My God, they make a lot of conch. And it was also great to see their industry in that image in the lower left, salt. That's why this island was even inhabited, because the folks in the early days, settlers that came there from Europe were there because there was salt. And obviously they brought slaves with them to help mine that salt, but it's that slave community that's still there. They're still thriving. So it's really, really amazing. And they build boats and they do all sorts of really cool things related to the environment. So I think it's really important for us to all remember that we all have power and agency. So they were having an issue with this salt pond. It was clogged up after Dorian, and we were like, what are you waiting for? Because this is your livelihood. And they're like, well, we're waiting for the government to come in and fix this problem. I was like, yeah, they might not. I was like, come show me what's going on. We go down there, and there's this pipe, and the pipe is clogged. That's all it is. And I was like, well, why don't you just clear out the pipe? And they're like, oh, you mean we can do that? I was like, yeah. They cleared out the pipe. Everything's going well. They're selling salt again, and everybody's happy. So I think it's really fantastic when you take that agency. Everyone has the power. So as I transitioned into a case study, I wanted to touch on this one point, and I do believe that artists have a lot to do with placekeeping, which is really important. I love art. I study fine art. I studied at SCAD because that's, you know, I love painting, and so that's the direction I think is important. And it was interesting for me to see that there are people out there doing amazing work. So we had an opportunity in Houston. We were invited by the Houston Parks Board to look at a project. And in this opportunity, we realized that, you know, we needed to know more about the local community. So our collaborators, our local partners, they turned us on to this group. Unbelievable. Project Row Houses. Have you ever heard of this group, Project Row Houses? Oh my God, I didn't know about them. Really amazing group. Danielle Burns-Wilson, the executive director, worked with us and touched on what they could do to be a part of the project. You know, if you understand this area, this is the third ward, or what they call the Tray, which is a really, really rich African-American neighborhood with a lot of really cool assets. But there was this row of shotgun houses that these folks, these artists, came together and transformed into a destination for culture and everything Houston. It's really, really cool. So we got them involved, and they were just really fantastic. So if you don't know about them, call them up. They actually do placekeeping work, right? So they're a really wonderful collaborator as well. So the project I'm going to talk about is in the city of Gainesville, Florida, all right? Similar to Baton Rouge, right? Land grants, big universities sitting there with a lot of challenging cultural issues, a lot of history, okay? African Americans live on the east side, everyone else lives on the west side, and the school is right in the middle. But the university is like building out and almost overtaking this community. And so there are a lot of folks that are very, very concerned about that, and that has been a challenge for them. And so getting to understand the neighborhood and going through this process with this community reinvestment area was really important. We were trying to help them understand ways for them to continue to be a very thriving community and not lose all that good stuff, right? And that was the challenge. So we went through a very, very robust process of getting to know them. We did several community engagement meetings. We had a week-long workshop session, which is great. It was fantastic. We met with all sorts of folks. And what I found very interesting about this is that people really came out. They really came out and talked and asked questions. We went through a lot of exercises, and we really received a lot of important data in order for us to do our work. But what I really loved was to see folks come together at the table and work together of all ages, multi-generational, with a lot of history. And you know the things they talked about? They talked about the things that matter to them, like the barber shop in the neighborhood. In this neighborhood, you had some of the first schools for children, African-American children. It was just really interesting to talk about what they found important. And then what we were able to draw from them were some just very, very simple things that they all agreed with, right? I found this interesting. They really cared about the history. They knew that Gainesville had these unique qualities, and they wanted it to be resilient. History kept popping up. You know, they really wanted to keep what they had, and we thought that was fantastic. And so, from a standpoint of what they think they should reinvest in, you know, small businesses, economic development, housing, certainly historic preservation. And what we did was we created images to help them visualize that, and the images helped them really look into what was it about their communities that made them special. Simple things, you know, we talked about how do they expand community connections, right? And so images of farmers markets like right in the community, right? Not down the street, right? Not around the corner where it's so hard to get to, but right in the community. They're like, all right, we can get on board with that. And these were ideas that they were bringing to us, you know, and so it was great to see this sort of democratic process of them bringing their ideas together and moving forward with what it could be. And I think looking at ways for them to collaborate and work together, and understanding that this whole week of discovery was allowing us to be better in the process of where we were going to. And I think what's also important is that tying those spaces together really mattered as well, and making sure that people could get to where they wanted to be, but in the same time, go to the barbershop, hang out in the sidewalk cafe, do all the things that make a place a place. And that's why we developed a plan for the people of Gainesville. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I call this presentation Free Lunch, Connecting Art, Architectural Design, and Community. So I like to start with the meditation or thought experiment, if you will, and that's how does one rectify the loss of home through art? Hurricane Katrina happened when I was 11, and by the time that I was 14, the sort of narrative of my work really started to become much more focused on what I felt I'd lost. This manifested into drawings of kids playing football, or what we called pitch-up tackle. We'd evacuated from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. When I would come back to visit, I noticed that my neighbors hadn't moved back, my friends hadn't come back. In fact, we hadn't come back. My family stayed in Baton Rouge. So at the time, I assumed we'd owned our home. I didn't know that we didn't. I didn't realize that the built environment could change so drastically. And these thoughts were, sort of pervasive and began to kind of manifest themselves in my art practice as well. But at the time, I didn't have the vocabulary to use the phrase like built environment. I only had my observations of my little neighborhood and sort of those, a couple of miles around there. So these observations began to crystallize without the adequate vocabulary and experience. There weren't really critical conversation around it at the time. It was just, essentially me pointing out what I was seeing and trying to think about how do you kind of deal with that through art. So, by the time I got to LSU and was in art school, some of the paintings became very place-based. So this is actually the street that I grew up on in New Orleans, sort of hearkening back to pre-Hurricane Katrina New Orleans. If you've never cracked open a fire hydrant, I'm not saying that you should, but not saying that you shouldn't. But as you can see, the paintings in this particular series that was also titled Free Lunch really became heavily focused on narrative of a particular place and time and memory, if you will. Again, just through the lens of an artist, right? At this time, I'm not introduced to sort of the more nuanced conversations around what the built environment is and our role in it. I'm just kind of observing and responding to what our reality was. So after the show closed, and this is another painting from that series, I began having conversations with Ms. Robin Miller, who was a writer for The Advocate, and I think a part of what made my work compelling was certainly being, on the LSU football and being the painter, so that was kind of a draw, but it allowed me the platform to have these conversations with people. So as I'm moving into my architectural and sort of real estate education, the next kind of thought process is how can we harness the power of design to heal? So this is a brief synopsis of my thesis work, which began to really try to think about how do you rectify the loss of, at the time, what was a lot of the built environment and a lot of New Orleans' black spaces and sort of that cultural capital, if you will. And so this set of photographs was actually taken about a month before the COVID outbreak. I assume everyone here knows what second line is. A show of hands. Okay, so we all speak the same language. Some places people aren't familiar. So this was a set of photographs that I took at a second line because this was also along the same timeline of when I was doing my thesis work and essentially thinking through how do you sort of capture a memory in motion, if you will. So these are drawings and sets of diagrams that I began using to try to document the physical movement in order to help inform design decisions around how we might rectify the loss of some of New Orleans' built environment. Before architecture school, I assumed that the built environment was static, but now it became clear to me that it was imperative that I participate in it and that you participate in it. So these are another set of diagrams, just thinking through movement, people's relationship to the built environment. It became more clear to me that, people is what made up home and the place was the stage. So harkening back to sort of my art practice, it really became focused on kind of movement and thinking about how we interact with the physical place. But again, there's that sort of cultural capital as well that's more temporal and not necessarily always a built environment. So this set of imagery shows more of my realization and try to rectify what I call a participatory design, where there's an art practice that's very much focused on work in the studio, and this for me is sort of a natural through line to take some of that work and those conversations and think about how can you engage community with it. I have a surprise coming up in a couple of slides that I'm actually really excited about. So again, if you look at sort of the painting and my studio practice, I think it becomes pretty clear sort of how the work within the community was essentially an extension of the same conversation with the work that I've been doing in the studio. So this work was while I was at an architecture firm in Boston with an organization called Restoring Promise, and their focus was on helping individuals in carceral spaces essentially, have access to a dignified living space. our aim, as it was, it's contentious to think through restorative justice design. Our aim was to simply try to give them access to resources that, again, brought dignity for every resident. And in that way, I think in our conversations, we learned more from them than we actually extracted. So Nate, the pocket park that your team helped fund and write the RFP for, my team, I was actually the lead designer on that park. And we did not. This is in real time. I hadn't seen Nate's presentation. Nate hadn't seen mine. But I grew up in Mid-City, Nate. And so the places, I'm almost emotional talking about it and thinking about it because I remember when this was nothing. You couldn't even tell that it was even a programmable space, to be honest. And now we have a beautiful bioswale there. We have the mural on the ground. It hosts a farmer's market every Tuesday and Thursday. There's a stage with access to electricity, and people can perform there. So it's a very active space now. And it's just fortuitous that we happen to share the same stage and are sort of on different sides of the development of this park. That was not planned. So this project was one called Pass That Joy. It was in response to COVID, and this was another instance of myself and a couple of friends responding to an RFP to essentially think about what types of artistic programming might we utilize to help residents within New Orleans. If you can remember, and especially if you had small children, not everyone had access to the internet at home. Not everyone had computers. You had parents trying to figure out, what do you do with the time? What do you do with the children while we're at work? There were a lot of questions unanswered. And so Pass That Joy was an initiative that brought a variety of resources to vulnerable communities. We provided arts materials, gardening resources, mental health resources, and internet to over 3,000 families, and we were able to partner with some of the elementary schools to help utilize some of their budget to give out lunches every day to those families as well. This project was called Art for Activism. We did a phase 1 and a phase 2, and it was essentially an art show / auction, sort of in the wake of all the protests, and again at the height of kind of the COVID shutdown. And it was a virtual practice that we did where we engaged local artists and held an online auction where people can, essentially bid on the work, and we then split the proceeds from the auction with the artists and with local organizations that were mission aligned, and were able to generate over $15,000 for artists and local organizations. And last meditation, what does it mean to grant agency to vulnerable communities through art and design? And that's my time.
Wow, I need a minute. Thank you, Brandon and Kona and Nate for those amazing presentations, and wow, what an awesome coincidence, synergy, just a great way to end the day. I do want to open up to the audience for questions and answers. I want to keep this conversation going, so please, anybody? Yes. Mark, and we do have representatives from CPEX with microphones, so.
Oh, good, thank you. I don't come from a design background, but I live in a designed environment. I haven't owned an automobile since 1991, and so I get around everywhere I go on a bicycle. Planning and development has emphasized the automobile. and we know the interstates and what they've done to our cities. What we miss, I think, is the pervasive car culture in our society. It's been on my mind how to build or rebuild a bicycling culture that can work hand in hand with planning to develop that sense of place that I get from going from place to place. I have a very, very different experience of my city than people who drive in it. And I think mine is a better experience. I get to see it, I get to smell it, I get to feel it. There are multiple routes to get places. So how can we work together to develop a reinvigorate a culture that is not a particular block, but a city? And that's way vague. I'm sorry about that, but it's been what's been on my head. Thank you.
So I have one answer to that question, which is that when we think about public spaces at the district scale or at the city scale, we think of the city as a network of public spaces, gathering places, of destinations that are connected to each other, right? And I know that seems like a really simple thing, but really focusing people on the places they want to go and why and what are they going to do there, and then figuring out the connections is one way that we kind of reframe the question, going back to an earlier session today. It's like, I feel like sometimes we get too caught up in a bike lane on this particular street rather than where are we going and how do we get there and what's the value of getting those destinations more easily.
I would add the why to that. It's like, why should you do this, right? There's so many benefits. You think, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I think I had maybe a 5-mile radius. I mean, I rode my bike to go see a girl, as most of us did back then. And because we wanted to be free. There's so much freedom in it, Mark. I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. You don't have to worry about parking your car, dealing with this and doing all that stuff, but you do get very engaged with the place. I do believe that good planning and policy and all of that can help us. I mean, go to Europe, go to the Netherlands. They're doing it very, very well, and everything's fine. So there are very amazing examples out there of how we can utilize different modes of transportation to allow us to be human, right? That's really what it's about. I mean, it's just to connect with the ground, get closer to the ground and not be separated from it in a car, in a vehicle. So keep planning well. Yeah. Need folks like you at the table. Need folks like you at the table.
Any more
Okay.
questions?
So I'm cheating. I have 2 questions. Is it okay? Both of these are probably a little bit more philosophical than tactile, I think, but let's try anyway. So one of the questions is for Nate about, you mentioned the placekeeping, and when I saw that list, I was thinking, oh, that's Big Mama and them, basically. That's what that list is for me. So my question to you, Nate, is how do we get resources to placekeepers? And then Kona, my question to you is, and this is really philosophical, so if we don't get to it, like, what do you think kept people from fixing the pipe on their own?
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, both really good questions. So my answer to the first one is it's really hard, and part of it is, it's a philosophical answer. We, for whatever reason, prioritize money for building things and not for running things, operating things, right? And that cuts across everything. But it's particularly a problem when we look at the public realm, right? Who takes care of the space? Who programs the space? When something's designed wrong and doesn't work, how do you fix the space? Is it going to take 10 years or is it going to take a year or a month, right? The answer to that question is whether or not you have money to run things. And right now, the reason why business improvement districts and homeowners associations are the 2 most popular forms of managing the public realm in this country is because they have dedicated forms of funding to run their spaces, right? They aren't reliant on donations or government grants and constantly asking for money, they don't have to worry about it to a certain extent. I mean, you know, there are economic dynamics they have to think about, but they know where their money's coming from. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think we really need to think about how are we funding the organizations that are responsible for stewarding our spaces, and particularly in communities that have seen disinvestment for decades.
Your question is actually very spiritual and deep, and I think a lot of it comes down to the way we've been raised, right? There's a lot of conditioning going on here, right? We know better. We know better, but we're waiting because we've been told to wait, right? Or we've been conditioned to expect someone else to take care of that issue. This is why I love entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurs are amazing because they're just thinking ahead. You know, a lot of artists are in the same space, right? You're just going ahead and just doing it. And so sometimes I think it's better to ask for forgiveness, just go get it done. And it was just so eye-opening to realize that they had the agency, but they sort of gave it to someone else. They just gave it away. It was like, guys, you can take care of this yourself. So I think in all your communities, you know, when you have organizations like CPEX, it matters because they are on the ground. They're engaging you and encouraging you to say, just go get it done. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait because you'll be waiting. Yeah, that's probably why they didn't do it. Just conditioning.
Okay, I have a follow-up question to keep it going, or do you want?
I'm gonna give maybe a slightly more optimistic follow-up to my previous response, because that sounded really bleak. I think that there are good examples, right? And you know, like so at our conference we have a lot of like grant makers that show up and talk about some of their exciting new initiatives and ways of thinking about things. And one of the really cool things I remember seeing, I think this is through the Kresge Foundation, they're working with intermediary nonprofits to help get grant money into the hands of residents that are not organized as a nonprofit, right? That are just doing work in their communities because they said, let's clear out the pipe.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. But there's no money that can get to them. They just, it's either they do it on their own or they don't do it, right? And so how do you get money into those people's hands? And I think there's sort of a barrier from philanthropy to there, and intermediary nonprofits can help, right? By doing things like being fiscal sponsors for residents, right? And accepting the grant on their behalf and then ensuring that it is used in the way that the philanthropy wants it. Right. Providing technical assistance, all that good stuff, right? And providing some things that maybe the local residents don't have, right? Whether that's design skills, evaluation and report writing, grant writing, all that stuff. So I do think that there are models, but again, like that's still not money for running things. I'll just point that out. That's still a one-off project.
Yes, as the grant writer for CPEX and a longtime grant writer, a big fan of philanthropy. Does somebody have a follow-up question?
One more.
New question.
I'll let you go first, and then we can talk about this afterwards.
Okay, sorry to derail that.
Not at all.
So in Terrebonne Parish, in the wake of Ida, we've recently completed a Main Street Corridor Master Plan, and all in, we've had probably 16 community meetings, public hearings, with the dots, with the Post-it notes, with the markers. It's rooted in a demonstration day that we did back in 2019, and then COVID hit, and then Ida hit. In my office, we call it COVIDA, but it all came to pass. And here we are on the face of a huge influx of federal money coming into our area. And we're looking at, a whole new streetscape for our downtown revitalization. And in those community meetings, we're messaging out that while we may be building this or putting this in our downtown, this can be done in any of our what were community commercial nodes that have long since disappeared, and there's very little place to keep, but there's still some there. And of course, because it's federal monies, it has to, CDBG-DR money, it's all rooted in low to moderate income and disadvantaged communities, and that is from one end to the other. It all has to be part of it. But it's easy to get the buy-in from the stakeholders and of course those business and property owners on Main Street, yeah, they're going to profit from it. But in most instances, they aren't the low to moderate income. The low to moderate income are the next block or 2 blocks over. So it fits the federal requirements, but we have a hard time engaging those folks because they're just seeing this as yet another instance where the money's not going to benefit those that it really needs to, or the project's not going to really benefit. So do you all have any experience in that, and how do we, we're reaching out to our faith-based organizations to try and really engage these communities, and we have some, I guess, community watchdogs that are becoming a part of the conversation, and all that's great, but do y'all have any experience in that challenge?
I would love to talk with you more after this. I'm personally working on 2 phases of housing currently, sort of the east side of Houma, where Senator Circle was devastated after the hurricane. And we have 90 units that are going to come under construction this year, and we're looking at about 120 units, but we're also trying to think about how do we engage the community on the front end. And we've had conversations with, Kelly Vernado. Yeah, we've had a ton of conversations with Kelly, and we recently met with the CEO of the Economic Development Agency, Cohen Guidry, and we're planning to go and meet with them in the next month or so to get a better understanding of what's the house, we deal with housing in particular, but what are those strategic partnerships that we can leverage in order to have people, have a seat at the table, so to speak, so that, even if it's a service that's maybe outside of our scope, we would love to at least, provide the blank canvas to have other organizations or members in the community come in and be a part of the conversation. And so I really would love to keep in touch, because we're going to have boots on the ground in the next month or so.
Any more questions?
I was going to speak up. Chris, you're absolutely right. It is challenging sometimes, but some of the things I was talking about in the keynote in terms of going to the people, even if it's old school door to door, that's how you get people engaged, and yes, they may be a couple blocks over, but their understanding is that what's in it for me, right? I'm not showing up. What's in it for me? I'm not getting anything out of this. Well, you got to show them what they're going to get out of it.
And I'll add, show them quickly.
Show them quickly before they develop a narrative that you can't control.
Right.
Because once that gets rolling, yeah.
Try to find ways that you can make good on what their ideas are or their observations are quicker than the timeline of the project, when you can. I know that's hard, but it's a way to build trust and build that momentum in the community engagement process as well.
That's great. I think we have time for one more question. If anybody in the audience has any burning questions that are still left unanswered. I see one person in the back. Thank you.
This is actually more, I'm curious, community outreach. How many here have heard about the Florida Corridor Plan? Okay, good. That makes me feel better. All right, because we're working on that, and I was just curious. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Yes.
You have questions
one more
for us?
right here.
Okay.
And this is for Brandon, and I don't want to misquote you, but I heard you say because of your platform, you were able to raise some money to have some impact in your community. But what do you say to individuals who want to have the impact but may not have the platform or influence that you have, but they still want to do something?
Wow, that's an awesome question, and to even further that question, something that I struggle with. So I'm kind of asking another question and then going to try to answer. Essentially, sometimes with residents in the communities that we work with, people have to work. sometimes people are not able to get out during those business hours and, kind of show up to community meetings at times that, may otherwise be convenient for them if they had access to more resources. And so it kind of creates this sort of perpetual silencing of certain residents in a way. And to answer your question, I struggle with it, but I think trying to leverage the internet, I think we have to do a better job on our end of making, putting the infrastructure in place to allow people to engage in a way that's convenient for them, whether it means running surveys at hours that people may be home, sending out mail that people can respond to. We are struggling and trying to answer the question of how do you get people to have a seat at the table, because the reality is, in a sense, a lot of times the loudest residents in the community are able to be loud because they aren't having to deal with the urgent issues of just keeping the lights on. And so that, I'm trying to work it out in real time, honestly.
Thank you. It's a great question, and that is all the time that we have for our Q&A. I want to thank our speakers, Brandon Sertain, Kona Gray, Nate Storing. This has been an excellent session. I'm not biased, but it was my favorite of the whole summit. But before everyone leaves, I want to turn it over to our President and CEO, Camille Manning-Broome, for some final comments to close us out for the day.
Thank you so much, and let's give our panel a round of applause. But before I say final remarks, I just want to highlight something that CPEX has decided that we do in all of our work, especially when we're going into community, especially low-income communities, is having stipends and doing sub-grants to community members so that they can own the outreach, they can own the initiative. We need to be the facilitators in the background, but they are the owners of the work. They are the owners of the ideas, and they need to be they need to be paid for their time. I also think that in Louisiana, especially, we've had a lot of extraction here, especially after Katrina and Rita. Researchers and organizations coming in and getting input from us and being very extractive, especially in New Orleans and the coastal communities. And so it just gets to the point of, what is in it for them? What is their benefit? And if we truly are there for them, if we're getting resources to improve their areas, let's make sure we put that money behind them as well. And so anyway, I just wanted to answer that question too. This summit has been such a rich discussion. I've heard from so many of you that it was both provocative and daunting in times on some of the research and the data, but also inspirational and hopeful. And I really hope that you all leave here with a sense of agency and commitment and responsibility. We are responsible. We are responsible for charting the course forward that we want to see. No one else is going to do it for us. We have to take ownership and responsibility in that. And we have to do it with love and respect of our culture and our people. And so I'm so grateful to you all. If you have thoughts on how we can do things different in the next 2 years, we'll be back, not next year, but the year after. We've moved the summit to every 2 years just because it's a really heavy lift for us. But I'm so grateful to you. Thank you. And this is it. All of the sessions will be on our website. We'll have the PowerPoints. They'll all be on YouTube. Thanks to Lamar Advertising, we are recording everything. And so we look forward to seeing you again soon. Hopefully we see you out in your communities next. So goodbye.